What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this week's episode is Adam Tooze. Adam is a professor of history and the director of the European Institute at Columbia University. He's also a prolific public commentator and author of several prize-winning books, and his latest, Shutdown, is most certainly going to make it onto that list as well. In the first part of our conversation, Adam and I work our way through the chain of events that occurred between the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 in January 2020 and the inauguration of Joe Biden, effectively the period that we now consider to be the first full year of the pandemic. In Adam's own words, we wrestle with power and knowledge in time in an effort to understand the nature of the forces that this pandemic has unleashed, their constancy, and the implications of those forces for shaping not only our children's futures, but more immediately, ours as well. In the second hour of our conversation, we have an opportunity to begin to dissect specific aspects and features of the modern world, whether those be the fragility of the neoliberal order, the threat, perceived or imagined, to the United States, its citizenry, and its power structure posed by the rise of China, as well as the future of warfare and how to think about the proper relationship between the state and the private sector in the context of the types of polycrises of the Anthropocene that Adam and I discussed during this conversation. It's a phenomenal episode, as you would expect. So without any further ado, please enjoy this week's conversation with my guest, historian and author, Adam Tooze. Adam Tooze, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Glad to be here.
So Adam, you and I were speaking earlier, and I was remembering, and we were both remembering, that you had been on Hidden Forces a little over a year ago. I think it was May 2020. And that was when New York was really suffering from the pandemic, and there was a lot of uncertainty. And I imagine that was probably around the time that you had decided to stop writing what was originally a book that you were working on that I assume you've started to work on now again, and picked up writing what I would describe as a kind of contemporary history, an attempt to grapple with what we were all dealing with in real time, the COVID pandemic, but also the response, not just the governmental response, but our emotional response to that pandemic. And you and I had actually discussed what it revealed, or what was revealing about our relationship to death, maybe our unhealthy relationship where we keep it at a certain distance. And so I guess one, I'm curious, is that a good framing, a good description of what your book is about?
I mean, the book starts with that question, as I think any serious attempt to grapple with the pandemic must, is, because there's different things that interrupt our ordinary lives. There's like malfunctions in the financial system, or trade wars, or recessions in particular sectors of the economy. But for me as an economic historian, all of a sudden here you're dealing with an event in which the driving force is a shift in the balance of the probabilities of death. That's what happened. And that was enough to fundamentally destabilize the assumptions that we make about safety, security in our ordinary lives, and in particular to put in jeopardy the functioning of the hospital system, which is, ultimately what this boiled down to. In the spring of 2020, we were all preoccupied with flattening the curve. Why did we want to flatten the curve? Not because we wanted to reduce ultimately the number of people that would die, because we knew we probably couldn't do that, but that we needed to modulate the pace at which they did become critically ill, such that the hospital system could continue to function. And that is indeed, I remember vividly us talking about this question of death. I mean, I live, on Broadway in Manhattan, between Broadway and Amsterdam, and within earshot of the runway that takes the ambulances up to one of the big hospitals here. And we were surrounded all the time, day and night, by just howling sirens with people being taken in a critical condition, to a very uncertain fate at that point, in intensive care units and on and off ventilators and so on. And that, I think, yeah, that's the kind of the thing that triggers this and makes it such a unique crisis. And then, but the question then is, how does that, as President Macron put it, like this anthropological shock, how does that intersect with some of the, what you might call the old familiars, geopolitics, financial instability, the vicissitudes, complexities of democratic politics played out, in vivid colors in the United States in 2020. So that's what the book's trying to do.
Is that why the economic damage of such a comparatively mild pandemic has been so enormous, do you think? Because the value we place on our lives and maybe the level of comfort and predictability, maybe that's actually it, that we have a kind of predictability around how we're going to die, when we're going to die, our ability to treat illness. I think that was also something that scared people with COVID-19, which is that they didn't understand what it was. They didn't know how to treat it. And I think that was really scary.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it exposed all of those sort of implicit assumptions that we have. And it goes into the details, right? The hospitals were accused afterwards of not having enough spare capacity and so on. But I mean, the hospitals aren't crazy. They don't court this kind of disaster. They had enough spare capacity to deal with a pattern of morbidity that they were familiar with. They didn't have enough capacity to deal with this. And then, yes, I mean, it turned out that we were willing to do really, frankly, almost unthinkable things to moderate this risk. I mean, it became incalculable. I mean, one of the things that happens if you lose control of a pandemic like this is that you end up making kind of impossible choices, choosing between two really disastrous options, one of which is mass death, which, the virologists were telling us would run towards 2 million casualties in the case of the United States. And on the other hand, an unprecedented shutdown of the economy. And part of that, you could say, well, it really wasn't damage. It was just a choice not to go to work. It was a choice to shut businesses down. And that's why, in part, I used the phrase shutdown rather than lockdown as the title for the book. But on the other hand, once we started doing that, it rapidly ran out of control. And that considered decision to do less of X and spend more time at home with our families and out of harm's way suddenly then becomes the trigger for a kind of rampaging out of control downward spiral in overall economic activity, which is then a full-on crisis. And that's where we think really have to speak in terms of damage. It isn't simply a choice we made, a trade-off we made, but actually harm. And suffered above all, of course, by the most vulnerable people in most societies, whether you're talking about street hawkers and informal workers in, Lima, Peru, or Delhi in India, or for that matter, the low-paid restaurant workers of Manhattan.
Yeah. Well, I remember you also saying that your wife's business was very much imperiled by the pandemic because she worked in the travel industry. And also your physical experience. Interesting to hear you describe hearing the sirens and the increased frequency of those sirens. That must have been viscerally frightening in a way that someone living in the suburbs in some part of the country that didn't have that level of outbreak wouldn't have felt. And so for him or her, the urgency of resolving the pandemic would have been very different. So, I mean, that's interesting, right? The revelation of the different experiences. And to that point, one of the things that's interesting about disease or malnutrition or things like obesity or even pregnancy is they reveal weaknesses in our bodies because they put our bodies under immense amounts of stress. And to follow that metaphor, I wonder, what do you feel that the pandemic confirmed to be true about the world and, more to the point, about us as a society? We mentioned one thing just now, which was our fear of death. What else did it confirm, do you think?
Well, I think it did bitterly confirm the worst expectations and fears that we had about American society. As Americans, it was humiliating to live through, I think, this experience of seeing those nurses in New York hospital wards, improvising personal protective equipment out of trash, garbage bags. I mean, it was lamentable and shameful. And then what we also saw was the inability of a society like America's to rally around collective action, to overcome those differences of experience, to recognize that something that was happening overwhelmingly in the Northeast. I mean, the crisis originally in the spring was concentrated really in 5 or 6 states in the northeast corner of the country, that it might ultimately pertain to everyone, and that in due course, it would come to the red states, it would come to middle America, it would come to the South. And that in any case, in some sense, this was a national challenge and ought to be addressed as such. All of that discourse failed. And then really quite fundamental chasms opened up in debates about what in some sense are really quite elementary decisions: to mask, to socially distance, and ultimately also, of course, to get inoculated, to get vaccinated. So it confirmed, I think, everyone's worst fears about what was true. It's not exclusive, of course, to the United States by any means, and it's important to puncture that conception, which is quite prevalent in the US, especially perhaps amongst liberals who bewail the situation that, in fact, this is a generic problem. It's true in Germany as well. It's true in Great Britain. They've seen very large-scale protest resistance against lockdown measures and against vaccination. So that's, as it were, I think, the grim story. The other thing that was confirmed, and this is, as it were, the flip side of that, is the just enormous potential that lies within the science establishment, the research and development capacities of modern societies. We did surprise ourselves in that respect as well. In fact, perhaps this is a bigger surprise than the disappointing conclusion that we're in a mess and incoherent. We were able to do something we really had never been able to do before: develop not just one, but a whole suite of vaccines for coronavirus, which had never been done before. I remember sitting in earnest conversations with colleagues from the STEM side of things at Columbia saying, we have to understand this is a complete crapshoot. We really don't have any experience doing this. And lo and behold, we have, at least half a dozen really quite effective vaccines, different price points, different pros and cons in each case, but not just one, but multiple solutions. So that's also something that we learned, I think.
So I want to focus in on something you alluded to, which I've been grappling with, and I still don't have an answer to it, which is we all kind of see it, and it's a transatlantic phenomenon, that society has increasingly fragmented. Well, of course, it's fragmented into lots of pieces. Categories are all artificial. I get that. But there does seem to be this bipolarity, this fracturing into two groups. And there's a lot of, it's not perfect cross-sections, but there's a strong alignment with support for Trump, a strong alignment with anti-mask or not wearing masks or protesting against masks, skepticism around the vaccines, etc. And I struggle to sort of understand what is the driving force underlying that. What is it that is really going on? And the closest thing I've come to is that what defines these two groups broadly is their relationship to the power structure, whether they trust it fundamentally or don't trust it. And I'm curious if that resonates with you, that if this is fundamentally an issue of trust.
I think that's not wrong. I like that diagnosis. I've arrived at a similar sort of conclusion, I think. I think I would disagree that it's a two-camp model. Personally, I kind of favor a six-camp model, which is more like, the spectrum of political parties we have contending in Germany right now. And there is a considerable degree of wraparound from the far right to the far left in Germany on opposition to masking, social distancing, and vaccines. And what they have in common is distrust of power. So this confirms your story, but imposes it on a rather different sociological mapping. And I think that's really crucial because, what those of us who say, for instance, support like the centrist, middle ground, conventional view of the coronavirus response have to navigate is a strange mixture, right? On the one hand, as it were, an affirmation of science, and on the other hand, also a willingness just to do as you're told, not to second guess, not to pit your intelligence against Dr. Fauci's, not to go out and do your own research and find some stuff on the web that tells you that you should or shouldn't trust this thing, but really just take the prevalent opinion. So it's a strange mixture of endorsing science, which is supposedly based on eternal skepticism, doubt, the demand for proof, and on the other hand, not asking for too much proof, and also being willing to maintain the faith even when the authorities change their minds, as they have. On masking, to mask, not to mask, they've gone back and forward on this. And rather than that causing a kind of fundamental loss of confidence, to say, well, reasonable people change their mind when the evidence changes. They took a while to figure out whether this was the right thing to do. Now they have, okay, now we'll do as they suggest. And what holds you in line there, exactly as you say, is fundamentally a kind of positive disposition towards the collective process of figuring things out, rather than a profound skepticism that you can believe anything you're told. And this was where, as it were, the line blurs to things like QAnon, where the core of that entire worldview was you had to go and find it out for yourself. You had to do your own research. That was what was so attractive about it. And I think that really does map quite nicely the problem that we've navigated here. And if you don't have that underlying trust, if you do have, as it were, a fundamental attitude of skepticism, then you easily descend into these sort of vortices, these spiraling circles of delegitimization and a sort of an undermining spiral in which, in the end, it's very difficult to found a truth on anything other than the sort of, go find it, make it up yourself, investigate yourself, do the experiment yourself, ultimately experiment on yourself, like all of these poor people who've been taking overdoses of veterinary medicines instead of vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, I would even take it a step further and say that it isn't a general type of skepticism or an equal opportunity skepticism. It's a very specific distrust of any agenda on which government, big business, and the corporate media are in alignment. Simply an unwillingness to believe anything that this power structure is pushing. And I have two questions there. One, how long has this been with us? Or perhaps more accurately, when did this trend towards distrust begin to manifest? And two, what's driving that mistrust? Because anecdotally speaking, I've been witness to this process occur in my own political and social development, beginning with the 2001 to 2003 period and the selling of the Iraq War to the American public, and then subsequently the great financial crisis and the bailouts of 2008 and everything that's come with that. Those two events for my generation and me personally were seminal in making me more distrustful towards my government and more cynical about concentrated power than I was when this century began.
I think that's right. And I think there's well-founded reason to be skeptical. When people talk to you about wars, you should be on your guard. And when people talk to you about high finance, you should be on your guard too. I think that is absolutely essential. That's just sort of the common sense of a critical and alert citizenry. I think to then extend that to saying when somebody from a similar position of authority in a pulpit tells me about a vaccine, I should be on my guard too. That's where I think, as it were, a constructive and healthy skepticism rapidly begins to shade into something which becomes more counterproductive. And this isn't to say that one should take Big Pharma at its word, or that all of the hype around the American healthcare system should be taken at face value. The opposite is clearly the case. And this isn't to deny that there isn't massive amounts of malpractice and excess treatment, or that, pharmaceutical companies are miracle workers and that they can deliver the silver bullet over and over again at zero cost. This isn't true. The vaccine program was in fact sold to many of the pharma companies as a kind of get out of jail free card, that this was their opportunity to prove themselves and to demonstrate that they were legitimate corporate citizens. Because previously, if you looked at the opinion polling in 2019, Big Pharma was pretty close to the bottom. It was up there with journalism and politicians as, the disreputable professions. Exactly that power structure that you were referring to. So this is a profoundly complex set of issues. I think when it really gets dangerous is when you have really quite unscrupulous and self-interested political entrepreneurs operating in this space and not just recognizing coldly that sometimes power lies, which it definitely does, but instead, as it were, beginning to sell a complete alternate reality that says everything that you've been told is definitely false. By virtue of you being told it from this channel, it's almost certainly false. Mm-hmm. And that therefore we need to start from first premises and let me guide you in the choice of what those first premises should be, because that then quite rapidly becomes just the substitution of, one falsehood for an even greater falsehood of a different type. But this is the terrain that, a brilliant sociologist, German sociologist, Ulrich Beck, who died before his time, mapped out in this extraordinary book, Risk Society, that he published in the 1980s, where he showed that, and it isn't just out of the operation of deceptive power, the Bush administration and the Blair administration in the UK lying to us about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or just engaging in wishful thinking about them and assuming the weapons must be there, which would justify the invasion. But even out of the logic of science itself, when it's taken seriously, you can spiral a kind of corrosive skepticism that is profoundly destabilizing. And it's very difficult for modern society to check that.
Well, I think this explains one of the things that you would often hear from vociferous Trump supporters, which is that he was honest, that he's authentic, that he's honest. And I think the reason for that, well, one, I think there was a lot of authenticity in Trump, but I think the reason for that is because so long as Donald Trump was speaking out against the power structure that they distrusted, so long as CNN hated Donald Trump was telling the truth. Because it wasn't about what Donald Trump was saying, whether he was lying or not, whether he was so oftentimes lying in the most technical, literal terms, which even his supporters could validate. It's that he was speaking to a deeper truth that we all know, but we can't put our finger on, which is that we have been lied to, that we have been bamboozled time and again by this power structure, this elite structure in society, which has consistently, whether it's NAFTA or the Iraq War, the 2008 crisis, and now with this virus, we're being lied to, we're being manipulated, and this is the person we're going to follow. And I think the uncertainty of the pandemic, the fact that there is no conclusive, no one can tell you with absolute certainty that if you get the vaccine, you're 100% better off. That's not how these things work. That's not how science works. Mm-hmm. And the inherent uncertainty of the moment, I think it's particularly vulnerable to an environment of mistrust because people are already not trustful. And so they're going to look at this uncertainty and seize upon it and concoct from there all sorts of alternative realities for which there is no scientific basis, but for which people feel justified because of the fact that they have been consistently lied to and they don't trust the messenger.
Yes, and I will say that Shutdown is by no means a book which is kind to the Trump administration, but I actually went to some lengths to avoid the kind of liberal demonization of the Trump administration, which I think actually, exactly as you've just so nicely described, creates a kind of hall of mirrors where we're just going back and forth between image, reverse image, thesis, antithesis. There's no resolution. There's no progress out of that. They're just, as it were, self-confirming antagonistic positions. And I do think that, to use that glib and too easy phrase, but like the liberal media were in a profoundly toxic relationship with Trump in that respect. And the book adopts a sort of almost studiedly, I try at least, to avoid that kind of spiral. This isn't to say that I don't regard the Trump administration as having been ruinous and posing a genuine threat to the Constitution of the United States. But the posture from which this described that, it seems to me, should, as far as possible, be to avoid being sucked into that back and forth, that tit for tat. One way of doing that is actually to move to the sort of analytical position that you just did, which helps us to explain why Trump actually has the appeal that he does and why, for so many people, more people voted for him than any other candidate other than those who voted for Joe Biden in American history. So I think this is a real problem that you're highlighting in writing about this also historically, especially from the sort of progressive left of center position that I do, that we do not ourselves become tied up in that kind of ding-dong, Punch and Judy fight with our antagonists. And so the book is also trying to navigate that zone. It's easier to do, and it's easier to be concrete about this when you think about economic policy, which is what I'm mainly interested in the book, where it's just not fair to say that the Trump administration was the worst of all possible worlds. In fact, the Trump administration surprised many of us in doing things that we thought maybe it wouldn't do. and enabling a really expansive monetary policy that was profoundly stabilizing for the entire world, which many of us, with perhaps centrist liberal preconceptions about the Trump administration would just be out of bounds for somebody so nationalistic and so xenophobic. But hey, presto, when it came down to it, he was there for the Fed in its most expansive policies. So the book is trying to walk that line. I mean it to be a critical intervention in a country absolutely riven by these tensions. But I, to be honest, want to be at some degree of distance from, as it were, the liberal counterparts to the Trumpist in this respect.
Yeah. Well, with respect to Trump's fiscal and the monetary and fiscal policy that was in effect during the Trump administration, I'm reminded of the phrase, only Nixon could go to China. And I think that having a Republican in the White House and having Trump in the White House actually made that much easier. So to that effect, I want to pivot and ask you something else, which is, it seems to me, and of course, like Trump was so much the harbinger of this type of chaos that I'm about to refer to. I mean, he really was, in my view, an agent of chaos. He did so much, and I assume that this is the way in which the man operated in his life for so many years. And one could probably dig in and find all sorts of fascinating insights about why he operated in this way. But regardless, he was very much someone that was trying to create chaos around to his perceived enemies and to anyone else in order to operate. But it feels like, separate from that, we have been operating increasingly in an environment of chaos. Everything is crisis. Everything feels like we got to act now, mindlessly attack this problem, throw money at it. This was the case in 2008 with the banking crisis as well. We threw money at the problem, but we didn't resolve the underlying systemic inequities and problems that led to the crisis in the first place. We did some things to reform the banking sector, but ultimately, the deeper rooted problems remain. I wonder if you agree that we are in an age of crisis. To that effect, is this a larger crisis of the neoliberal order that we have been living under since the end of the Cold War, which actually I've heard you insightfully say that it's not actually ever ended, which might be an interesting avenue to go down. But so do you agree? How do you view this? Does that resonate?
Yes. I mean, I think we are in a state of perpetual disorder. It's naive to imagine that we're going to return at some point to more orderly circumstances. I agree that to escape the treadmill of constant crisis fighting and immediate, large-scale, headless chicken-style responses to gigantic threats, we would need structural change. But then if you look at the political situation and the difficulty of coordinating large states and majorities within them around structural change, it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. So I agree that we are caught in a kind of progressive dislocation, disorientation, tearing apart of structures. You could say that this marks a sort of terminal crisis of neoliberalism. I think that's, in a sense, again, promising too much. It's certainly an unmooring of previous conceptions of stability. Take central banks, right? Let's move this away from the very abstract to something more concrete. Like once upon a time, we thought we knew what they were about in the 80s and the 90s, the early 2000s. They were to be independent, staunchly conservative, target price inflation. That was their job. And then all of a sudden, it turned out they had to fight financial panics on a huge scale. And then those panics produced a situation of such fragility that the central banks had, in a sense, to go on fighting those panics. So they never got to normalize. And then it became obvious that, as it were, the dislocation of the social system that resulted from this, the increasing inequality, was also a matter of concern. So there was never a way back, and there still isn't, I don't think, to that conservative conception of what the central bank is going to do. The question is, as it were, can you shape a positive agenda for it going forward, or does it remain a series of ad hoc interventions? And to that extent, I agree with you that somebody like Trump, who's chaotic, who didn't have a principled bone in his body, who really was devoid of any strong ideological commitments, was a man of his times. I think that's a fair description. And in a sense, Biden too and the team around him are not doing old Obama-era Clinton-descended economic policy. They're doing something much more open-ended and experimental and, frankly, rather more desperate. This is last chance saloon in many respects, especially with regard to the climate change problem. We have to start now, and we have to start big now. Otherwise, the choices that will face us a few years from now, and certainly by the next decade, are absolutely terrifying.
So what do you think are the major challenges that we face? And when I say we, can we go as broad as Western society, the world? I'll leave that to you. And when I say major problems, I mean challenges or problems that we can actually address. I don't know. Yes, we could address the trust issue, but that is such a wicked problem. There's no one person in charge of rebuilding trust in society. So I'm curious what you think those are and what the pathways are to begin to address them. And also if you think we're actually moving in that direction, for example, with greater fiscal spending or monetary policy.
I mean, depends who we're talking about here, who the we is that's implied. I have to say that if the we that's implied is the United States, then I am actually profoundly pessimistic about the possibility of, the American federal government acting as a progressive vehicle for change anytime soon. There was a moment early in 2021 when I think we were more optimistic. Indeed, the first draft of the end of the book had a distinctly more optimistic feel to it than the final version that people, have in their hands now. Because I think there was a moment early on in the Biden administration where it seemed that the doors had opened, that they were going to force through a series of really dramatic infrastructure and transformative spending packages. And it's become clear that either the ambition is not there or the opposition in Congress is simply too fierce, and the divisions within the ranks of the Democratic Party itself are so deep that it's very difficult for them to carry through anything like that with anything like that kind of ambition. So if the question is, are the big problems that there's any prospect of the United States addressing anytime soon, then I'm afraid to disappoint you on that score. I just don't see that. I think there's some hope of incremental change. Some investment here and there in key areas of infrastructure will definitely help. Maintaining and returning to a high level of employment will definitely help mitigate some of the inequalities in American society. But I do fear that the United States, in part because of its constitution, in part because of the utterly perverse stance of the Republican Party, in part because of the interests of American society at large, the assumptions that we make about the American way of life, and in part because of the interests in the sense of business and capital, is going to be very difficult to shift. And there's not, frankly, a lot of positive momentum in the right direction. That doesn't mean to say that, it's not a huge relief that it's the Biden administration at the controls. But I think the sense that this signaled and betokened a sea change has been quite rapidly disappointed, and a sort of realism has returned. I have to say, somewhat surprisingly, that I'm not as fundamentally and radically gloomy about the prospects for progressive change in Europe on the other side of the Atlantic. But the fact of the matter is it's smaller scale. It's just not as big a piece, for instance, of the climate pie as the United States is. And neither of them, the United States nor Europe, is really the decisive variable in the climate problem at all anymore. If we take that as our sort of metric of the really big challenges facing humanity at the present moment, China is. And the fact of the matter is that we're essentially dependent on the first moves being made by them. The moves they make will decide the issue. But that isn't really, as it were, something over which we as Westerners, people in the United States or Europe, have much influence. So I'm afraid my sense is that we are quite severely stuck, particularly in the United States. And no, I'm not optimistic about large-scale change.
Well, that's interesting because it speaks to the changing nature of geopolitical power. Because up until now, the last 30 years, for the world to act meaningfully, it was at the very least assumed, and in practice oftentimes confirmed, that the United States needed to lead. That was the U.S.'s role in the world.
Yeah.
And I think and this is a perfect opportunity to talk about Afghanistan, which is that it seems increasingly true, not just in terms of policy statements, but also in terms of actions, that the United States is taking a different tact, that it may be in fact beginning to turn inwards. That doesn't mean that it isn't willing to project power, But insofar as collaborating with allies, I mean, the Europeans in many ways expressed surprise by the manner in which the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan. What is your view of that, of the changing nature of the global order and how countries and peoples can collaborate and attempt to solve risks like climate change, which is a global phenomenon, and it has complicated drivers. There's huge amounts of uncertainty around how to address it, to what degree the climate is changing, because these are nonlinear systems with feedback. Again, we don't know. So I'm curious, how do you see that? I mean, with the U.S.'s role and as it changes, how the rest of the world and other countries are supposed to find consensus?
Well, if we start with this diagnosis of a kind of impasse in the United States, and you then ask yourself, well, where is, as it were, the locus of agency? Where could agency come from in the United States? There are two different ways of thinking about that, both of which I canvass at the end of the book, and of which I think 2020 gives us some degree of, an indication. One is to say, look, if it's true that the United States as a nation state structure is a bit of a busted flush, then one option is to say, right, well, then at the state level, action matters. And this is something you come back to again and again and again when you discuss climate politics in the United States with folks. They say, well, yes, okay, we despair of Washington too, but look what's going on in California, look what's going on in New York. These are very large pieces even of the global pie. These are significant slices of the world economy. If action happens there, it really doesn't matter what happens in Nebraska and Oklahoma, maybe Oklahoma because of the fossil fuel industries. But large parts of the rest of the United States simply don't weigh in the balance one way or the other. If New York and California get their act together and they drag other parts of the Northeast along with them, then we're already changing the game. So that's one type of answer, go down. Another way of thinking about this, which is the way I think was really exposed dramatically in 2020, is that maybe we have to think about American power as operating not in a compact nation state form, but as a series of sort of disaggregated powers. So with regard to the financial system, the Federal Reserve, for instance, operated with extraordinary autonomy on a huge scale, stabilized the global financial system. All it needed was for Trump to not meddle with what they were doing, to egg them on, and to hold, as you were saying earlier on, the flat earthers in the GOP and Congress at bay. And so long as he did that, so long as he performed the role, as it were, of the conservative acting revolutionary, the Fed could get on with its business. And I think that's also, but meanwhile, America's domestic politics could be tearing apart at the seams. The Constitution could be at peril. We'd have, effectively interventions by the military saying, no, they weren't going to do a coup. Like that could be going on at the same time. On the 6th of January, as all hell broke loose in Washington, D.C., the markets in New York were booming because they believed in the promise of the combination of a fiscal policy delivered by a Democratic Congress and the Fed. So that's also a way, I think, of thinking about how American military power operates, which is that, sure, American politics may be completely incoherent and indeed self-paralyzing. And I think one of the implications of that is that the troops have to be pulled out of Afghanistan because there's simply no majority for that kind of military presence in the United States anymore. And that's what fundamentally drives it, right? Biden never wanted to be really deeply involved in nation building anywhere. He didn't want to be involved in nation building in Haiti in the 1990s. He didn't want to be involved in nation building in Afghanistan either. And the polls told him he was right. The vast majority of Americans wanted out of Afghanistan. That does not mean, and it would be a complete mistake to imagine that this means that, as it were, the Pentagon and the American national security establishment is pulling back. Afghanistan is a sideshow. It's humiliating the way we left, but it's a complete sideshow. If you look at the Pentagon's budget, it's at historic record levels. If you look at the specific bits the Pentagon is really spending money on, the futuristic bits scream out. America is spending more than $100 billion a year on military R&D. This is absolutely staggering, the levels of spending that are going on here. And that is not about pulling back. It's not about limiting America's power projection, as you quite rightly emphasized. It's about redefining how America does it. And above all, of course, refocusing on the challenge of China. And I take that to be, as it were, pretty symptomatic of where we're at right now. Bits of the American government machine cut loose, really, of overarching political direction, can move quite powerfully and continue to dominate the world in various crucial ways. They receive a kind of ad hoc cover, depending on the particular job at hand, from various sorts of bipartisan coalition in Congress. But what we no longer have is a sort of compact, coherent 1940s, 1950s style big government project in which things are joined up. It's kind of constitutively incoherent. It's kind of division of powers, but not in a check and balance kind of way, but more in a do your own thing kind of a way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think you would agree, though, that there is a difference between the U.S. military as an institution and the central bank, because the central bank has a mandate that's pretty unchanging, whereas the military is informed by missions that are assigned to it by the civilian leadership. And so that relationship is much more interconnected. And what terrifies me, quite frankly, is the world we're moving into with the types of technologies that are available to war planners without having a responsible civilian leadership and an electorate that not only trusts their leaders and that justifiably trusts, because we don't simply want an electorate that just goes along with whatever their leaders tell them, but where the leaders can be trusted to actually do the right thing, to develop a whole of government approach to a particular problem and not allow simply the institutional forces of the military industrial congressional complex, the lobbying, and all the incentives that drive that dynamic from taking over, from hijacking the process.
I mean, I think that's true. I mean, in that regard, Afghanistan is quite telling, I think, because it's quite clear that the Joint Chiefs didn't want the humiliation of pulling out of Afghanistan. They would quite happily have left 5,000, troops in Afghanistan to stabilize the situation. That's clearly what Milley wanted. And he was overridden. I mean, if Afghanistan tells us one thing, it's not really about America's position in the world, but it is telling us quite a lot about who's in charge in Washington. And it's the Biden team that are in charge. And this was a lesson that Biden learned during the Obama years. He watched the military railroad Obama into the surge in Afghanistan and was appalled by what he was seeing. And Biden, I think, also watched the American military resist Trump's desire to pull out of Afghanistan. I mean, the American military 2 times in 2020 really countermanded the clear intent of their commander-in-chief. And one time was over the domestic political scene, where it's quite clear that Trump wanted, in a sense, to suck the American military into his bizarre campaign to retain power. And on the other hand, they also resisted his push to exit Afghanistan. They did their best to sabotage his desire to pull out. And if Biden had had pulled back from the peace deal that Trump had negotiated, so-called peace deal, he would, in a sense, have been doing the bidding of the military, which is one of the reasons why I don't think he thought he could pull back. Mm-hmm. So I think at that level, we are seeing a clear assertion of control by the Biden team. But the Biden team themselves are a hand-picked, assortment of Democratic Party hawks when it comes to Asia. People like Campbell, who's in charge of China policy to a very large extent, go back 10, longer than that, years. And he was pivotal to the shift towards a more forward posture in Asia announced by then Secretary of State Clinton in 2011. So there is a deep continuity here. These people do have incredibly strong relationships to the military-industrial complex. In their time out of office, they circulate through think tanks which have those kind of connections. And the mission that they've set, and it's a clearly formulated one, is not something mysterious or they are not in the least bit ashamed about it. On the contrary, I mean, they have no desire to hide their project at all. The aim of the game is to pivot American power towards containing communist-run China. That's the plan. It has been for a while. It's been emerging over the period of a decade at least. And that is what they're quite concertedly pursuing. And I think it's all hands on deck, frankly. They also have a pretty solid bipartisan commitment for this project in Congress as well. And that's how this power is being redirected. And the extraordinary thing about it is it does, in fact, extend into economic policy as well. So we are seeing the emergence of out of this maelstrom, out of this chaos, of an organizing pole. But that organizing pole is antagonistic towards, America's largest and most significant counterpart in the world, which is China.
So that's actually one of the main topics that I wanted to cover with you in the overtime, which is the pivot to Asia, something that was started by Obama. And again, much of what we're seeing in the Biden administration is picking up or learning from the lessons of that administration, of watching, or either also the fact that many of the Obama hands are not part of the Biden administration. You've written a lot about China. I'm very curious to ask you first of all, what it is that maybe we get wrong about China in the West. Not only most people that write about China don't speak Mandarin, they didn't grow up in China, and we're peering into another country, applying templates, oftentimes analogies to Germany, or to, as I've done, try to draw analogies from the pre-World War I era to today. But oftentimes those may not be accurate. And so I want to ask you about that, as well as the U.S. pivot and what the approach to China you think is going to be or is. I'm also curious to hear what you have to say about what I think is a very troubling cultural and economic trend, which is this transformation that we've been witness to of financial markets from serving as an efficient mechanism for channeling capital to becoming something analogous to a riverboat casino. And what that says about not only the long-term health of our economy, but also the responsibility of regulators and policymakers who I think have actually enabled this transformation. And that speaks to this larger feeling that there's no one driving the bus. You know, the pilots have left the cockpit, not just at the regulatory agencies, but increasingly in other areas of government that we rely on for the proper functioning of our country's institutions. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Adam, as well as the transcripts and rundowns to this episode and every other episode we've ever done, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, or subscribe directly through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. There's also a link in the summary page to this episode with instructions on how to connect the overtime feed to your phone so that you can listen to these extra discussions just like you listen to the regular podcast. Adam, stick around. We're going to move the second half of our conversation into the subscriber overtime. For more information about this week's episode of Hidden Forces, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.